tardes a todas, todos. Vamos a arrancar con la segunda, sesión del programa, con la plática magistral de la profesora Kathryn Sikkink. Yo voy a hacer una breve semblanza. La profesora va a tener unos 45 minutos para presentar su plática. Luego yo voy a hacer unas reacciones iniciales y luego abrimos el foro para sus preguntas. Entonces, la profesora Kathryn Sikkink es Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy en la Escuela Kennedy, en la Universidad de Harvard. Es doctora por la Universidad de Columbia y fue profesora de la Universidad de Minnesota por 25 años, durante los cuales contribuyó decisivamente a expandir la disciplina de la CRI para incluir, cobijar el estudio empírico de las normas internacionales. Su especialidad es el estudio de las redes transnacionales de defensa y protección de los derechos humanos, el impacto de las políticas públicas de promoción del derecho internacional de los derechos humanos, movimientos sociales y la justicia transicional. La profesora Sikkink ha sido investigadora o profesora visitante en múltiples universidades de Latinoamérica. Es una región en la cual ha enfocado su trabajo de investigación desde los inicios de su carrera, según entiendo, y por sus múltiples y muy destacadas contribuciones académicas al campo de las relaciones internacionales y el derecho internacional. Ha sido designada como miembro de la Sociedad Filosófica Americana, la Academia Americana de las Artes y las Ciencias y el Consejo de Relaciones Exteriores. Y el día de hoy nos va a presentar una plática cuyo título es ¿Cuál es la eficacia de la justicia nacional e internacional en derechos humanos y otros mecanismos de justicia transicional? Entonces le damos una gran bienvenida a la profesora Sikkink. Es un honor tenerla aquí con nosotros.
Primero quiero agradecer la invitación de hablar y sobre todo la ayuda de todos ustedes y sobre todo lo de Daniel García. Y es un placer y un honor para mí estar aquí con ustedes. Quisiera hablar en español, pero no quiero que los pobres traductores tienen que traducir mi español a inglés, ¿no? Entonces, mejor que yo hable en inglés para que mis colegas que están con auriculares me entienden directamente y los traductores puedan hacer lo que deben hacer, traducir mi inglés al español. So, I will switch into English, and I want to say first that I really enjoyed the previous panel, and I want to give just a short bridge from that panel into this one, because that panel was about compliance, and Professor Dye gave us a wonderful understanding of what compliance can be, and showed that we can think about compliance in law and also in the social sciences, right? It's not a category only for law. But notice that our title is about efficacy. Efficacia, effectiveness. Our panel is about effectiveness. And it's because we often get in this dialogue that we had in the previous panel about compliance, right? And I completely agree with Professor Dye's notion that a compliance is on a continuum, that we virtually never get total compliance. And as a social scientist, I am interested in effectiveness, which is another way of talking about compliance, but effectiveness, we always realize that it's not going to be full effectiveness, that it's going to be probably a partial effectiveness. And so, but we need to know whether something works, okay? Whether it actually works at improving the situation we want to improve. And if it works, it's less important that there's 100% compliance, or if it's partial compliance, but we can see from our research that it's having a real impact on the issues we want to improve, then as a social scientist, I'm very satisfied with impact. And we've developed methodologies over time to try to talk about that kind of effectiveness. So think of it this way. Think of it that we had we had kind of zoomed in on Professor Serrano's wonderful discussion or thought-provoking discussion about disappearances in Mexico, and Myra's discussion of the Inter-American Court. We zoomed in on very important compliance issues that all of us care deeply about. Now I'm asking you with me to zoom out, okay? I'm an international relations theorist. I study the world, that's my job. I've been part of a research team that for many years now, various research teams for many years have been working on establishing a database of transitional mechanisms all around the world. And so that's what I'm going to be presenting to you today. Now, Professor Dai was right that my entry into this field was very much through a book called Activists Beyond Borders, Advocacy in International Politics. And I made strong arguments, and I make them to this day, for the importance of domestic mobilization, for the importance of transnational advocacy. And I believe that it's, as the panel I think said, that it's that kind of work often done by victims and their allies that has moved ahead the entire human rights enterprise. But quite early on, my colleagues said, yeah, but does it work? You know, and I needed to turn to research that I thought could really respond to very skeptical colleagues who thought none of that human rights stuff really works. And in order to do that, I began developing a small database by myself. And I first used, and now I've come to be part of a team. We call it the Transitional Justice Evaluation Team, or with tools called TJET. And other members of that team that I need to mention right now because they are producing the information I'm sharing with you. They're working with me to produce information, especially Jeff Dancy, who's a professor at the University of Toronto. He was going to be here today on this panel with me, but his son, unfortunately, was quite ill, and he couldn't be here. But you may have seen I have his name on the slides. He produced these slides, helped produce these slides, and a part of it is very much extremely recent work that he has been doing analyzing our new data. And so I want to really give credit to Jeff Dancy, Professor Dancy. But also I have other colleagues, Fung Pham and Patrick Vink from Harvard University, and they are some of the world's leading experts on surveys, large population surveys in conflict zones, including surveys of victims, about what populations in conflict zones want in terms of justice and in terms of peace, especially. And so I'm really speaking on behalf of research that I've done together with this team. So we want to do evidence-based, victim-centered justice, victim-centered research that can inform policy, okay, and especially to prevent future atrocity. That's our goal. Now, I've been working on this issue for a long time. The first time I used the term justice cascade was actually in 2001 with an article I wrote with a colleague, Ellen Lutz, who worked with human rights activists in Mexico, actually. And it was right after the Pinochet arrest in London. Everyone wanted to know what was going on with these foreign trials. And my colleague, Ellen Lutz, had worked on foreign trials in Argentina, with Suarez Mason, and in the Philippines with Marcos. And so she and I wrote an article together that was called The Justice Cascade, but it was just about these foreign prosecutions. Where did they come from? Then in 2011, I wrote The Justice Cascade, the book, and there it became the big picture, not just foreign trials, but really the rise of individual criminal accountability in the world, and looking at international tribunals, foreign tribunals, and especially domestic tribunals that were doing individual criminal accountability for human rights violations. It got translated into Spanish in Argentina. Notice the incorrect title. I didn't catch it. That it's Juicios de lesa humanidad. Como los juicios de lesa humanidad. That's an Argentine thing, right? They call all their trials were de lesa humanidad, and so they call it la lesa. And that's actually the wrong translation of my title. It's not just about crimes against humanity prosecutions, it's about human rights prosecutions more generally, including those that aren't crimes against humanity. So just a correction there. The rest of the book is translated correctly. If anyone, it's still available in Spanish. In that book, we talk about there's 3 models of accountability for human rights accountability in the world, prior to World War II and continuing strongly today. Okay, there is the sovereign immunity model. We could call it the impunity model. It's a model where state leaders, high state officials, are simply not held accountable. The state accountability model is a model that is used by virtually the entire UN system. Okay, where states are held accountable, no individual leaders ever go to prison. And it's also the model used by the regional human rights courts. So the Inter-American Court, the European Court, the African Court are state accountability courts. Now the Inter-American Court played a unique role. It's a state accountability court, but through its rulings on amnesty laws, through its findings, like Barrios Altos, that the amnesty laws were contrary to state obligations under the American Convention, it opened up a lot of domestic space around Latin America for domestic criminal prosecutions. And so, but nonetheless, we're not looking at the regional courts, we're not looking at the ICJ, we're looking at individual criminal accountability, and we're doing it at 3 levels: the international prosecutions, where they're doing criminal prosecutions, the foreign prosecutions, which do continue, and especially domestic prosecutions. And one reason I wanted to write that original book, The Justice Cascade, is because there were a lot of arguments out there about trials not working, trials being problematic. And I believed, and many other scholars believed, that there was reason to believe that human rights prosecution could be effective for things that we care about. They could enforce human rights law, they could deter or socialize state officials to keep them from violating human rights in the future, and especially they could help build the rule of law, which is, I know, is an issue on many of your minds here today in Mexico, how to build and protect rule of law. So trials help build rule of law by reinforcing this key concept in the rule of law, and that is that no one is above the law. Nevertheless, there were powerful causal claims that prosecutions could worsen human rights and worsen conflict. Okay, and this started out early. Some of the older people in the room will remember when countries like Argentina started holding trials back in 1985 with the Juicio de las Juntas, the trial of the juntas, many people, including people very sympathetic to human rights, like Guillermo O'Donnell, said, that's dangerous. It will destabilize these new democracies and lead to military coups. So that was worrisome. But then there were colleagues, in this case in the United States, my colleague Jack Goldsmith at Harvard Law School, Stephen Krasner, a leading IR realist, as well as Jack Snyder and Leslie Vincimori, who made a claim that I found very puzzling, and that is that the use or threat of human rights prosecutions could actually cause, and here I'm quoting, cause more human rights violation than they prevented. Okay, so, and then finally, 2 other things. One, that the notion that human rights prosecutions could interfere with peace processes. We've heard that a lot, and we know we should worry about it. We look at the Colombian case here, Pablo's from Colombia. He knows that in the negotiations with the FARC, right? FARC at first said, no way are we going to accept any prosecutions. If you make us do that, there's no peace deal. So we know that's what, in peace negotiation, key actors make that argument. We don't know if it's true or not, but we know they make that argument. That also, a final argument, I think this is one of the most popular ones today, and that is that restorative justice is better. It's better because it is more likely to contribute to peace. It's better because actually that's what the victims want. The victims want restorative justice, not retributive justice. Now, once again, there's some evidence to the contrary, some in Colombia, including, right? But there are powerful claims among many scholars today that restorative justice is the way to go. We should forget about these difficult, controversial trials. So I felt that given these powerful arguments that really were saying this was the wrong way to go, that we needed to address the causal issue. We had to say, how do you know that? What's your evidence? Because it didn't look so good sometimes, you know. Goldsmith and Krasner provided no evidence. Big claims, No evidence, okay? And so this was when the building of the database began. We said, we'll build a database on trials and eventually on other transitional mechanisms, and we'll use our database to test that causal claim. And the only way you can test that causal claim is if you've got database on data on a lot of countries. Okay, you can't test that claim in a couple of countries. So this was the source of the database. But you see why I'm saying I'm zooming out. All of a sudden, I'm not looking at a single country, we're not looking at a single court, and we're not even looking really at what we'd call compliance. We're certainly not looking at compliance with sentences in courts. We're looking at compliance or effectiveness in a very broad sense, and that is, can we look at all the data we have available, and can we say, here's trials, here's our countries that have trials, countries that didn't have trials, what's their human rights situation like after they have trials or don't have trials? You know, you can think of it, wanting to know, well, is a country like Argentina, it does better with human rights because it had trials than a country like El Salvador or Brazil that had amnesty laws and totally blocked trials. Okay, but we do it on a global level, not just comparing a few countries, but comparing many countries. So we needed the evidence that I built, and the evidence started with Hyunjun Kim, the first evidence with a colleague Hyunjun Kim, who helped me write the first article where we used pretty bad, but best we could gather at the time, data on trials around the world, and we found the first time ever that human rights prosecutions are associated with improvements in human rights. And by human rights at that time, and I'm speaking here to Chris Ferris, who's the leading person on how to measure human rights. At that time, we were using the political terror scale, and we were looking at physical integrity rights, disappearance, extrajudicial executions, death, of course, but also political imprisonment and torture. So it was a narrow definition of human rights, but it was an important definition, as you still see today in Mexico with the rise in disappearances we just heard about, right? But in the process of gathering all this trial information, we started saying, well, people say, okay, what about truth commissions? Do they prevent human rights violations? What about reparations policies? So we started adding in many other forms of transitional justice that you see on this list. And some of them, like amnesties, of course, are ambivalent. They're meant to block trials, but some people believed that Vinjamuri and Snyder believed that amnesties were good. You should do amnesties. That would settle things. And so we wanted to test the impact of amnesties too. Okay, so going 15 years later, I am working now with this great big project with Jeff Dancy, and we have a brand new website called it's at transitionaljusticedata.org. I'd actually like all of you to go there, but not right now. Because when you get there, you're going to find it so interesting that you won't be able to listen to my talk. But I want you to go there because we worked really hard on it, and especially Jeff Dancy and Timo Toms. And it is a repository of all of these, all this data I mentioned to you from 1970 to 2020. We just updated from 2010 to 2020. And it is easy to access, so you get that map, you can click on a country, it opens up the country, and you can see in that country what kind of trials, what kind of truth commissions, what kind of reparations policies, and on the trial data, even specifics, who was prosecuted, for what crime, okay? When we can, but it's very hard, what happened on appeal, okay? And so this data can be downloaded. So people who do, I should say it's qualitative and quantitative data. This is not only quantitative data, there's a lot of qualitative data there as well. As I said, names of people being prosecuted, for example. But also a description of the Truth Commission, a description of the reparations policies. But also, you can download the quantitative data, and we also have surveys that my colleagues from FAM and Patrick Vink have done in conflict zones. We have their survey data available. We have as well a list of our publications, we have policy briefs, and we have a reply button where you can complain to us and give comments to us. So this is this is in real time, we update. And so if someone is an expert on a country and you go and you find an error, there's a place you can go on the website where you can tell us there's an error, and we will look into it. And if we think, you're right, we'll make changes on the website. So that's why we really like people with many different eyes going there and taking a look at things so we can get your feedback for the website. So this is just an overview of of what's happening from 1970 to 2020 for 4 of the most important of the mechanisms that we look at. Okay, so amnesty laws, and you see the number of total amnesty laws that we have in the database. Reparations policies 79, truth commissions 117 in the world, and then trials, and you see why the prosecutions are on a totally different scale, of course, and we have 6,146. These are human rights prosecutions in different countries. I should say they don't have to have convictions. There's some people who only coded trials if they got convictions. And we believe that the whole process of prosecution was important, that you wanted to look at the whole process, not only ones that led to convictions. Obviously, a legal system where you get 100% conviction, we know is not a rule of law system, right? So it's important that we see also that people are acquitted. But you'll note the different trends. Amnesty laws are down, but many of those amnesty laws are still in effect. So in El Salvador, Brazil, for example. So that amnesty law, new laws going down, doesn't tell us of the power the amnesties still have around the world. But the most important trend that you see there is the trend in prosecutions. You see it peaks, and because we have lots of data points, also it's smoother, but we see a clear trend here. It peaked in 2010, and it's been going down ever since. And that's something I want to ask you to help me think about at the end of the talk today, because we don't have yet, this is brand new data, we've just been looking at it for a little over 9 months or so, and we do not yet have a good explanation. One thing we almost certainly think, in the justice cascade, I said that a precondition for the justice cascade was the third wave of democracy. And the third wave of democracy, as you know, is over. There's no fourth wave, there's democratic decline. Anibal will tell us exactly how much. But no one, we may disagree about how much decline. No one disagrees that there's some kind of decline going on. And so that precondition is missing now. And that could be the main explanation. We have done some preliminary work suggesting that is one of them. But I think it's more complicated, and I really would like people's feedback on that one. So you see reparations policies and truth commissions are going up and down, but they don't have that same strong secular decline that trials do. And so there's something going on unique with trials that doesn't deal with all forms of transitional justice. Okay, so here's the whole data set. So even though the data set is about transitional justice, in fact, the truth is it's about human rights accountability around the world. Okay? In other words, we have 58 non-transitional countries in it. We have 198 countries altogether. And so it's a source for human rights accountability in transitional and non-transitional societies. We've got 2 kinds of transition from authoritarianism to democracy, and transition from conflict to peace. And then we have the double transition. There's that Venn diagram. There's those countries that are doing both transitions at the same time. Okay? Now, we decided just to put all our data up and let you, the users, be the people who would filter it. So the user can go in, and if they only want to work on democratic transitions, they could simply add the filter in and only download the data for those countries that made democratic transitions. Okay? If you only work on conflict, likewise. Okay, so it's not like we force you to work with the whole data set. You are given lots of choices in terms of the years you want to look at, and in terms of the type of countries you want to look at. So I want to now share with you some of our findings, our initial findings. It says transitional justice, improve human rights in practice. So this goes back to the topic, right? Effectiveness, or my kind of compliance. Okay, does it improve human rights in practice? And I'm going to be showing you something that is called a coefficient plot. Now I'm getting some slides here done by Jeff Dancy, but I'm going to try to walk you through. I'm assuming many of you are not familiar with a coefficient plot, but a coefficient plot is just a visualization of a regression, okay? And basically, if those little dots there are to the right of the vertical line, that means that those are variables, the titles on the left there, variables that have a positive impact on respect for human rights, okay? And if it's to the left of the vertical line, note amnesties, that means it does not have a positive impact on human rights. So just to, and the vertical line going through the dots, those are confidence intervals. That just shows how much uncertainty there is. And if the confidence interval goes over the vertical line, that means it's not statistically significant. Did I got all that right, Chris? Okay. But I'm trying to focus here on the main findings for you. Yes, with exception of lustration, trials of other transitional justice are associated with greater respect for human rights or fewer physical integrity violations. Again, by human rights, we mean these physical integrity violations we talked about it. And of course, we are controlling for other factors that we know influence human rights. We're controlling for democracy, we're controlling for war, and we're controlling for level of economic growth. Everything else we know that we should be putting in the equations to make sure that the effect really are the mechanisms we're looking at are going into these. And so controlling for everything, these transitional justice mechanisms still have a statistically significant independent impact on human rights outcomes, okay? And so we believe that is, that's effectiveness, and we believe it's a kind of compliance, okay? And we believe that they can be guarantees of non-repetition. Now this came up in Professor Serrano's discussion, but what people call guarantees of non-repetition, you know, in the legal world, the UN world, are not. In other words, it's a mixture of policies. No one knows actually if they prevent anything, if they're a guarantee of non-repetition. I do not use that terminology, that UN speak, guarantees of non-repetition, because I'm a social scientist, and when I say non-repetition, I mean this. I mean, we have evidence that there is actually, that those mechanisms of non-repetition have a causal impact on human rights. So I can tell you here that these trials, truth commissions and reparations, are guarantees of non-repetition, if you put it this way. They're not, they contribute to improvements in human rights, and as such, used effectively, they could guarantee non-repetition, okay? But just creating more and more state bodies, like Sandra told us, you know, we don't have any evidence. And in fact, we have a little tiny bit of evidence about creating more bodies. One big deal in the international system lately has been to create more UN investigating commissions on Syria, on Iraq. These are all out there gathering evidence for future trials that may or may not ever happen. Okay, and that we have checked, and it turns out that these UN investigating commissions do not have an impact on human rights practices, right? So I would say if the world is investing money in things, they should not be investing money on more investigations of prosecutions that probably will not happen. No, it's a little unfair because some of our foreign trials are on Syria, they're happening in Germany, and they are using some of the Syrian data from the UN investigation. So the only way right now those UN investigation groups can have an impact is through foreign trials, okay? Okay, secondly, amnesties are not associated with less respect. Okay, so you gotta be careful with amnesty laws. I'll talk a little more later about that. Second, does transitional justice strengthen or weaken institutional democracy? So we're going to talk here about two kinds of democracy. What's the impact transitional justice has on institutional democracy and behavioral democracy? And by institution, we mean this. So don't, more coefficient plots. Don't just read the three things that are up there, right? You can't read the top one, can you?
Clean elections.
Clean elections, okay. We're going to look at three things. Clean elections, judicial constraints, which is a big issue, and freedom of association. And I'm going to focus you in on what we find. Transitional justice is associated with improving electoral and judicial institutions. Okay, so again, using the same methods I talked about, right, before, we see this association. between transitional justice and institutional democracy. Does transitional justice strengthen or weaken behavioral democracy? Okay, again, what do we mean by that? We look at the political engagement, anti-democratic civil society organizations, and a political polarization. Okay, those are three types of behavioral democracy we're interested in. And we see that, again, with the exception of lustration, transitional justice is associated with greater political engagement, okay, including participation, political participation. That and this engagement is not anti-democratic. In other words, transitional justice is not associated with engagement in anti-democratic civil societies organizations, okay? And then finally, however, this is super interesting, and I'd be interested in any comments you people have. However, transitional justice is associated with more political polarization. Okay, so really, what's that about? And because some of these, literally, some of this is so recent that we're like discovering and going, wow, we didn't know that. I wonder how we're going to explain that one. And we can think about why it might lead. Certainly trying to hold political leaders accountable, as we've seen in the United States, right? Trying to get rid of impunity for Trump contributed to polarization in the United States. So it could be that these human rights prosecutions are similar in the sense of they're utilized by populist leaders to attack democracy, and that leads to more polarization. Is on post-conflict states. I know that may not be your biggest interest here, but as you saw from the things I cited, that there's a big concern still today that transitional justice undermines peace deals. And since it's so important to resolve conflict, we need to take this really seriously. So this is now a different kind of model we're using here. It's called a survival model. Apparently it was used initially with cancer survivors, looking at the survivor of cancer survivors. But now you're using this model to look at the survival of peace. Okay, so, and what we know is that after you have a peace agreement or you have a peace deal, that there's often a recurrence of conflict. The most troubling thing in the world of peace and war is not just you have one war and one peace. No, the most troubling thing in the world of peace and war is that you have countries that have one war, they have a peace deal, they have another war, they have a peace deal, another war. It's this failure to have sustained peace. And so on average, you see post-conflict societies 60% of the time break down to a war again, to another conflict within 10 years. And so what we did was see what happens if those post-conflict states adopt trials. This is just trials, no other, just prosecutions. And it makes them 80% likely to make it to 10 years of peace. So not perfect effectiveness, they still are only 80%, but that's what we call effectiveness, okay? That's not 100% compliance, but that is effectiveness. Because trials are associated with 20% decrease in the sustainability, 20% increase in the sustainability of post-conflict peace, okay? And so people who say, oh, trials interfere with peace, they need to grapple with our findings here. And I think they don't want to, partly because I think conflict scholars just got allergic to human rights a while back. And they just so convinced that human rights stuff doesn't work and just gets in the way of their pretty peace agreements. But also because insurgent groups I'll put it this way, insurgent groups and governments agree on one thing, and that is neither of them want accountability. Okay, so you go to a peace table, and the one thing they can agree on at the beginning is let's make a deal to protect ourselves from any accountability. Okay, but this shows that accountability can make a difference for the survival of peace. Here, reparations have an effect, a much smaller one, if you do reparations policies. And so there's a slight increase in peace sustainability, but the relationship is weak. And again, interestingly enough, truth commissions do not have an impact. Okay, and again, I don't know why, but But my hunch is this. My hunch is in our Truth Commission data is very mixed. And that is, there's some countries that have amazing truth commissions, publish big reports. In Argentina, the Truth Commission report is the most, to this day, I think, one of the most purchased books in Argentina. And you have many that don't ever publish the report. Okay, you have Truth Commissions in name, but no report, for example. So the Truth Commission is for show, it's not for real. And I think because the Truth Commission data is mixed like that, we often have hard time sorting out the impact of Truth Commissions. Okay, so associated with a slight decrease, but a weak relationship. And then just finally, I do, like I say, some of the stuff I'm presenting is really hot off the press. I'm presenting unpublished data and material to you today. But there's some of it has been published. This is a piece by Jeff Dancy in the journal International Organization about amnesties. And it shows that the amnesty question is also complicated. Okay, so first you do have to amnesty rebels. Okay, you've got to amnesty them. If you tell a group, we're not going to amnesty you for taking up arms against the government, then they won't come to the peace table. So you've got to say, we amnesty you for taking up arms. Okay, then you have to amnesty political prisoners who are in jail, right? And that's, we forget, that's why Amnesty International is called Amnesty International, because amnesties used to be about getting illegally or, unjustly detained political figures in jail. We're going to amnesty those people, okay? But, so amnesties can help in transitions. They may be necessary in a peace deal, but amnesties that amnesty extreme human rights violations do not promote peace. Okay, so places like Guatemala that exempted genocide from their amnesty, for example, that was the right thing to do because later it made it possible for them to prosecute General Rios Montt for genocide. And so I want to just end here first by the question I want you to help me with, which is the end of the justice cascade. We are working with our colleagues on a piece called "Is the Justice Cascade Over?" Now you can imagine that's like hard for me, okay? But this is a really good reason for the discipline that some of this quantitative work makes us do, is even your most kind of, well-known or the thing that's closest to your heart, that you have to be faced with data that says, whoops, something is happening, and you're gonna have to explain it and maybe adjust your approach. We know that democracy has something to do with it, but I think there's other things going on. Okay, it's not. Someone will say it's the international trials, because international trials are down. Used to be we had the ICTY, the ICTJ. We used to have the ad hoc tribunals in Sierra Leone, and all of that is done. And it's all international criminal prosecutions are happening at the ICC. The ICC is not big enough to handle the numbers that the ICTY and others did. But it turns out that foreign international trials are such a small part of the trial data that they cannot explain this decline. Okay, there's another thing I've been thinking about, which is that states are sometimes prosecuting using other crimes. The French apparently are prosecuting human rights violations by non-state armed groups just using terrorism. It's a lot easier to prosecute terrorism than human rights violation. The United States government, you may know, is using visa violations to prosecute so leaders from foreign countries that have engaged in human rights violations have come to the United States in exile. And the visa form, and I've seen this visa form, the visa form asks you to say, have you ever committed war crimes? And when I first saw it, I went what? What's that about? Everyone's gonna say no. So they say no, and then if literally there's a group in the current State Department, we'll see if it survives, I think it won't, that looks, and when they find people who have come in as exiles who were responsible for war crimes or for crimes against humanity, they prosecute them for visa fraud. Okay, because again, it's a lot easier than to do a serious human rights prosecution. And so there may be another explanation out there that we're missing, and I just want to get everyone put their thinking caps on and see if you have any ideas for me. So with that, I will end, and I guess Pablo and I get to have a conversation, but after our conversation, I will very much welcome your questions and comments, and I want to call out the person on in that photo is Timo Toms, who's another of the main people working on our website. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathryn, for that very, very interesting talk. Not sure how to proceed, because I was sort of taking notes very quickly and trying to gather a few questions. So should I have a few points that I picked from your talk. Should I make them all, and then you respond, and then we can come back, or open the floor? Is that a good?
So usually, yes, if you, whatever you want to do.
How do you want to do it? Okay. So I'm going to go from very broad to very narrow, from the zoom out to the zoom in. And the first question I can't help asking, because I've been teaching and studying your work for a long time, and the justice cascade is a very powerful model. I think most people who work on human rights in Latin America have been using it and thinking about human rights with those conceptual keys. But one thing that always bothers my students and myself when I'm teaching this is there is this assumption, let's say, in the model, that is Western states are willing to support these transnational networks to improve the cause of human rights in some delinquent state, let's say. And I think that's very much, or was very much the case in the 19th and maybe 2000s, which is when you were developing all your models and theories in a very strikingly fertile way. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how do you think about that model in contemporary, I mean, given the changes in contemporary politics, the change in US foreign policy, less willingness to support human rights or to promote human rights elsewhere, maybe Europe as well. So this assumption that you made in the original formulation a while ago presuppose a willingness to support human rights in foreign policy that perhaps is not there anymore. So it's a very big question, but it's a question sort of I want to ask you to sort of speak directly to our geopolitical situation now. I don't know whether to stop there, let you talk, and
I think because
better,
now
right?
I can see it'll be a better conversation, because I want to be able to talk with you about this. When you first said that, I said, give me the exact lines of the book, because I'm not sure that there is such an assumption. For example, I always knew the Argentina case is at the center. I always knew the Argentine case moved ahead almost completely without, I mean, the United States at that time was willing to not oppose it. They felt okay about it. No money went to Argentina around those trials, as far as I know. Or even that nowadays there is a lot of Western I did a paper on using this data about gender, and I'll talk about the later, gender and transitional justice. There is money flowing on gender and transitional justice. Like, you want a gendered truth commission, you're going to get more. A truth commission that looks at gender, you're going to get more money, you know. But in the early truth commissions, I do not believe that, and especially the Argentine, the Chilean, that ones that were so important to me, I never thought that my point has been protagonism from the Global South. I wrote a whole article about Global South protagonism, and I'm tired of people acting like the Argentines never would have thought of doing their trials if it hadn't been for the US. That is false. Sure. That's false, okay? So first I want the proof in the actual language. So, but yes, then there are, in the modern period, okay, so the early period that influenced me, I think it was not there. In the modern period, there was many more flows to support various institutions. The ICTY is created by the Security Council with lots of US support, piles of US money goes to the ICTY. So we have to kind of go one by one, okay? And I believe the ICTY, of course, was deeply supported. And then the ICTR, when African states said, see, you Europeans only support European courts. When Europeans are killed, you don't care about Africans being killed. And then a lot of money flowed also to the ICTR. Okay, so those international tribunals and ad hoc tribunals did get foreign funding. But the domestic prosecutions that are the backbone of our data often did not. They were prosecutions carried out in the regular judicial system of the countries.
No, so can I respond?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that makes it fun.
No, so the specifically is your article with Finemore, sort of the classic IO piece. where you're talking very broadly about international norms, human rights norms, but you're not talking specifically about prosecutions. So I confess I need to maybe update my syllabus and assign your book instead of the old paper. But still, I think that the question, let me rephrase it then to be more fair, is you have, and you still said that you still believe that transnational networks are really important, and that there's this sort of combination of inter or transnational dynamics and domestic dynamics, and that's where the action is in a way. And there's some people who have been somewhat skeptical, and maybe Beth Simmons is sort of a moderate, sort of a sympathizer, but she's more of the idea that the action, the real important action of human rights takes place domestically, right?
That's it,
and,
yes.
Yeah, and so I hope I've been a bit more fair now, saying that you have, let's say, more faith in international dynamics of diplomatic pressure, conditionality on foreign aid, things like that, not necessarily to enact trials or maybe direct support to the judicial systems or transitional justice mechanisms, but pressure, you really cannot do this without some sort of trial. Giving amnesty to this person would be unacceptable for the US. Another kind of more subtle, diffuse mechanisms of diplomatic pressure. So I'm not talking specifically about trials, but about this sort of willingness to, let's say, play the identity card of we believe in human rights and democracy, and we want you to believe on that too.
Okay, so I'll give you the evidence you need to give me. The evidence comes from Activists Beyond Borders, and especially Power of Human Rights, okay? And the interpretation of people of Activists Beyond Borders is it is about the international community imposing its norms on the developing world, okay? Now, the key model in the Activists Beyond is something called a boomerang, okay? The boomerang starts in domestic societies, okay? And so when people say, you only think international groups impose their will, I'm saying, look at the boomerang. The boomerang starts domestically. Groups, like groups in Argentina that I was studying, who were cut off and repressed by their governments, decide to reach for allies outwards. And I watched that. I worked at WOLA, a human rights organization in Washington, D.C., and the late 1970s, early 80s. I watched these human rights organizations coming to Washington, D.C., and I learned the boomerang from them, okay, that they faced repression at home, they needed support to protect themselves, to keep themselves alive, and they went seeking allies, and that created the advocacy network. But it started in these groups at home, okay? And Beth correctly talks about domestic mobilization. I give her very much credit for that. All I want to say is that domestic mobilization was the key that started the boomerang in ours. But I believe, okay, so Beth is, and I wish she were here, she's the great scholar of the impact of international law, right? But she does not pay enough attention to transnational influences, okay? So you're right that Beth and I can complement each other in some way. She puts almost all the emphasis on domestic mobilization. I completely agree that domestic mobilization is important, but there is a transnational dimension. Let's look at these foreign trials. I just said, we've got exiles, we've got Syrian exiles, both perpetrators and victims, who are in Germany, who use a German law to prosecute. The victims bring the case against the perpetrators in German courts to prosecute. So I'm always interested in the transnational dimension as well as domestic mobilization. Okay.
Okay, so basically, just to be clear, you still believe in the power of those networks. And I was just remembering, I recently read about Argentina, and the extradition to Germany was very important. It was a norm of jus cogens that began the whole thing in the 80s. It was this really interesting move. That's...
But you asked me to talk about the current thing.
Exactly.
And I will, because it is true that with what's happening with democracies, including what's happening with Trump in the United States, means that no one can depend on the United States. The United States has gone from being part of the solution to part of the problem. Okay, so, and with democracy declining, we have a smaller and smaller number of countries that can support these transitional justice processes.
Return the boomerang, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. So no, am I worried? Of course I'm worried. That's why I think something like that may be going on. We're worried about it for democracy promotion, we're worried about it for human rights promotion. It is not a good time in the world. And I think human rights activists have to gear up. And so one of the reasons why I even want to present this data is because one way that helps human rights activists keep doing their work is to know it's effective, right? And one problem in the human rights literature today is there's a big movement of people who say human rights are the problem, not the solution. So, you know, my most recent book, well, not third to last, but Evidence for Hope was all about, there's a bunch of scholars like Sam Moyne, like Jack Goldsmith again, like David Kennedy, like, you know, people who just say human rights are the problem, but they never tell you what their solution is. So it's a very comfortable position, right? You say, you get to critique human rights, and then you never have to offer any alternative. And I also think human rights people, take that so seriously. Amnesty International did a whole volume just on Sam Moyne's critique, you know, and I think it's important to be able to have the tools to push back a lot. Like, oh, if human rights are the problem, you tell me the solution, because I don't see it. I don't see a solution to justice and dignity in this world that doesn't involve as one key factor human rights.
So what I had in mind is not so much whether, I mean, that seems obviously too extreme, but whether human rights organizations with their scarce resources and, you know, high opportunity cost should still be thinking of, you know, as it were, throwing boomerangs and finding transnational partners, friendly states, and, you know, Europe is the threat of nationalism and far right is there, or should they just concentrate, as it were, their resources on domestic political mobilization, very local or more local advocacy, and in a way sort of adjust their strategies given that the geopolitical context now is not so friendly or receptive to their demands. So that would be more the question, like, you know, I'm also a believer in human rights, but the question is, so politically, what would be in this different context that we live now, not, you know, very...
One, it's a great question. These are all great questions, by the way. It's a great question. And I do think that groups always have to continue to focus on domestic organizing. And that there were times when people were so enamored with a boomerang, or enamored, the women's movement during a time got so enamored with international conferences, you know, oh, Mexico City, and then Copenhagen, and then Nairobi, and then Beijing, that, I mean, literally people I interviewed said, and we didn't have time to do our work back home. We were so busy preparing for Beijing, you know. And then they realized, no, they had to go back and really do the hard work of domestic organizing. And so I believe that's always needs to be the case. Now, but I don't think that one can just, you know, see your country as the only place you work. But I do think that strategic activists will need to make different coalitions. And another great Colombian scholar, Cesar Rodriguez Garavito, has talked very well about Latin Americans need to find Latin American allies, right? And what was done to protect the Inter-American Commission at one point when it was under attack from right-wing Latin American governments, and they organized a coalition of NGOs of different parts of Latin America, and they were more effective as a Latin American coalition saving the Inter-American Commission than a US-led coalition would have been, okay? So, and so yes, you know, like we just saw another bad election in Venezuela, and I think the most important actor in the future of Venezuela is Lula. And Lula is finally getting his act together to be able to say something about Venezuela. It took a really long time. And, you know, you guys, I mean, here's my most sincere question. The dilemma is, in Latin America, the human rights was adopted by the left, okay? But when push came to shove and leftist governments like Chavez violated human rights severely, a lot of people I thought were human rights people shut up about it. And it made me wonder, is it real belief in human rights? Or is it only belief in human rights when, you know, if it's against a government of the right? And so I think that you know, that's important. But new coalitions. I don't think you can get rid of boomerangs or but new coalitions and more creative coalitions and taking advantage of emerging powerful actors in the global South.
South-South coalition.
Yeah.
Thanks. This is great. So I have another critical question, and I'm now a bit more hesitant to raise it, but I'll raise it anyway. And it has to do with the, yeah.
It always makes discussion better.
I know, well,
Okay.
a bit more difficult. So, and again, so Moyne has been arguing this, and not only Moyne, a bunch of people being critical of what has been called the anti-impunity bias. There is too much work in human rights, or too much emphasis rather, on resources devoted to trials, criminal trials, punishing the guilty. And perhaps when we do that, we leave aside things that are very valuable, perhaps more easily attainable, perhaps not so polarizing. And so I see here, within Latin America, just to put it in that way, there is a bit of a tension in what may be called the Argentinian model, and the Argentinians have been super emphatic on punishment and very proud of their, I don't know how many there are now, but like 3,700. I was reading a really good work by Alejandro Chetman from Ditela, and he's been reconstructing transitional justice in Argentina, and it's like 3,700 up to 2022. It's huge. No Latin American state has done that. High-ranking generals, colonels. So it's a very sort of national project. And Colombia is very different, especially with the FARC, because there's a lot of emphasis on reconciliation, alternative penalties, amnesty, not for international crimes, but for a very broad group of troops of the FARC. And the idea is they can serve their sentences in agricultural colonies, work outside, be outside. And for some people, that's okay, fine, they're going to their fincas, and they're having a really good time. That's not fair, we should punish them. And that had a lot of traction in the plebiscite that turned down the peace agreements. So there is the punitivism. So despite the sort of populist anger at that kind of perception that we're being too lenient, the peace accords managed to sort of stick to the reconciliation emphasis. And I was wondering, what's your take on this whole debate, let's say, on the value of punishment? You've done a lot of work on human rights trials, but now you're integrating reparations and other forms that are non-judicial and non-punitive. But I have to say, I sympathize with the perception that there's been too much emphasis on punishment, and that punishment itself is not necessarily a very good thing, so it should make the wrongdoer suffer because he deserves it. And maybe we should pay more attention to other forms, non-punitive forms, or very mild, sort of apparently punitive, but not very painful for the perpetrators. I was wondering, what's your sense of that, your moral sense, I guess?
And that is, so very early on, in the first work I did on trials, we also looked at truth commissions. And Hyunjin Kim and I found that both trials and truth commissions were effective in improving human rights, okay? But then other research done around the same time, some of Lee Payne's research and some of Jeff Dancy's research showed that truth commissions didn't work. And I think we were starting to see this bad truth commission phenomena, right? You could say I'm a truth commission, but then you didn't publish a report, or you didn't pay your staff, or whatever. So what the argument makes you here is based on ongoing research, okay? The amnesty stuff, we've got good stuff, like, no, don't come and tell me blanket amnesties work, they don't work, okay? But partial amnesties can work, okay? The reparations is just, really, we've had reparations data for a while, but we're just beginning to really test it. And it looks to us like reparations are having a very good effect, okay? And so I believe we should look at what works and use that. But for a long time, okay, the most consistent finding we have from 2010, so, to 2024, 14 years of findings, better models, better data, different methods, better methods. Never at one point have trials ever fallen out as not having a positive effect on human rights. Okay, so I have an empirical bias to trials, not because I love punishment. And the reason I think that's true is I believe that deterrence is doing part of the work. Repressors are powerful individuals with impunity, okay? And I don't think they're socialized. And I don't think they're happy that people are getting reparations and they're not going to prison. Because the state pays reparations and they get off scot-free, okay? So I believe that those individuals are only deterred, they're not socialized, and unless we have a deterrent in our mix, that it will be hard to ever make the changes we need to make. But I'm completely open to a wide range of transitional justice options if we have evidence they work. For example, not UN human rights, not human rights investigatory commissions by the UN, but yes, reparations policies domestically. And I think Colombia is the new model, not Argentina. Argentina is old stuff. Colombia is the new model. It's a model of many kinds of justice, and it's not a model without trials. No, these are serious trials that are happening.
It's not a punitivist model, let's say.
No, okay, so when people mix that up, they say, oh, all trials are retributive, and therefore we shouldn't have trials. But the ICC had Colombia under preliminary examination for how many years? 20 years, the ICC. They never once said that you couldn't do the HIP the way you wanted to. Okay, why? Because the ICC has rules the way it has to prosecute, but complementarity does not require it to impose its model on Colombia.
Well, I know they adjusted the sort of the jurisprudence or the doctrine to accommodate the Colombian model. There's a lot of back and forth, but the outcome is okay. This complies with the statute, the Rome statute.
And so I do some of this. The game language is not incorrect. Some of this is a complicated two-level game. Okay, the Colombia is a perfect example. The FARC said no trials, never. The Colombian government said, I'm sorry, we're members of the International Criminal Court. Complementaries exist. You no longer have that option, no trials. Your trials are trials in The Hague or trials in Colombia. What do you prefer? That's how you got the peace agreement with thing. It wasn't for love of restorative justice.
Well, that plus trials, but not jail time.
Yeah, exactly. But so our trial data, it tests the process of prosecution, not just convictions. We show an effect of the process of prosecution. We show effect of the rank of the perpetrator. Because our sentencing data is not good enough, we don't have good stuff on sentencing, but our effects do not depend on punitive sentencing.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So we should turn to some of the people.
Yeah. So should I just read randomly?
From the bottom, that was the first person who turned it in.
Okay. El primer paso para que los juicios sobre derechos humanos tengan efecto es un poder judicial independiente.
Sí.
Next.
No se puede. No. So I'm still going to keep going in English, but no, you cannot. So a certain amount of judicial independence is necessary for trials to exist and be effective. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
¿Cómo se compatibiliza la metodología global del proyecto con las particularidades de cada región o país para superar sus conflictos?
So I hope that the answers I've been giving give you an idea of that. Okay, so we have this global data set, but we are very able to incorporate this unique Colombia tribunal in our global data set, because our prosecutions do not require that you have a certain level of punishment. We don't say, oh, punishment, that we count that. No, we say, is the judicial branch, or in this case, a very special judicial, unit, is it, identifying perpetrators? Is it indicting people? Is it issuing arrest warrants? Does it have procedures for presenting evidence? And then we say, yes, counts as a trial. Okay, so that means now the one area where we had a hard time taking into account differences between countries was around the issue of customary justice. At one point, there was a lot of people being quite excited about customary justice as an alternative to retributive justice, right? And so we did at one point try to code, and we found that 75% of the literature on customary justice came from just 2 countries. It came from Rwanda, the Gacaca trials in Rwanda, and from Uganda, I think Matu Opo or whatever. And so a lot of the excitement was excitement about only 2 countries that happened to have traditions that allowed them to try to use those traditions for mass atrocity with difficulty, okay? But then we did find, in the end, I think 14 or 15 countries around the world that had used some kind of customary justice because they still had legal systems that permitted some traditional forms. Okay, in other words, it isn't a solution for the world. It's possible in a handful of countries. Guatemala was one where there still are some apparent provisions for customary justice. So that idea was, and we stopped gathering data on because there wasn't global data. Okay, it's not an issue subject to global data. But otherwise, there's a lot of variation and a lot of permission for variation. You know, the Colombia reparations policy has 12 hechos victimizantes, right? 12 kinds of harm that they can repair for. Initially, Argentina had 1, disappearances. Then later, political imprisonment, you know, they added in a few more. But we can code for reparations policy that have 12 kinds of, in fact, that's one of our variables. How many harms are being repaired for? You know, is it 1 or is it 12? Truth commissions, we can look at, the first one in Uganda, which gets counted, and I think we probably have it, but I don't like to count it, was Uganda. Idi Amin, he tried to kill the truth commissioners. You know, I don't think that should count as a truth commission. So anyway, so I believe that a global database can account for quite a lot of variation in different countries and do justice to that, but some things are, like customary justice, turned out to be beyond what we could do.
Can I ask a follow-up precisely on this, which is one of the questions I had here, is the case of Mexico. Because here, I think a lot of people say Mexico hasn't had any transitional justice. We wasted the opportunity to do transitional justice with the democratic transition in the early 90s. There was an attempt, but it failed. But the reality is that Mexico has done a bunch of truth commissions. There's recently a big enterprise of the Comisión de Esclarecimiento Histórico that was very large, published a multi-volume thing. At the end, it was really not received by the government, so the conclusion was unfortunate, let's say. I don't know if you would code in your database as a truth commission, but I think Mexico is really interesting because there's a ley de víctimas, a ley de desaparición forzada, truth commissions in Guerrero, national truth commissions, there's reparations in the ley de víctimas. So you have all these measures, but you have a systematic, a big transitional justice law. You have just transitional justice mechanisms implemented, not synchronically even. Would that count as transitional justice?
Well, one is yes, in the sense that Mexico is in the database. I am not at all an expert on transitional justice in Mexico, so I'm not going to attempt an answer, but I'm going to say, what luck. Here we have a bunch of Mexican eyes that will go and look at what we coded on our database for Mexico, and you can tell us. You can tell us whether you think that we're on track or not. Okay, and if you think there's some big problems there, I can ask you to write your remarks directly to our people into the website, but you can also give them to me as well. Okay?
One thing I should say, which may or may not be useful, is that the term transitional justice is not very used in Mexico. The term reparations is, and the program reparations is awful, but so I wonder if you're a nominalist in that way, which is only if they call it transitional justice, no. I
showed you that slide saying we've got 59 non-transitional countries. I believe it just should be called human rights accountability, okay? But if you call it that, people don't know what it is for some reason, you know? And so we're stuck with this word transitional justice, which is not the best word, because people kind of know what you mean. But it's really about human rights accountability.
So let me go with the next.
Yeah.
¿Qué razones pueden explicar la caída de las persecuciones criminales, del peak into 10 and then the fall? ¿Se trata de una pérdida de confianza en las instituciones o se explica más por el paso del tiempo y la necesidad de las sociedades de trascender?
I do think there is some loss. There's some loss of confidence. And I do think part of the loss of consequence may be a result of this turn towards restorative justice. I think the popularity of restorative justice has undermined willingness to support trials, okay? And like I say, we're showing good effects with reparations policies. I'm completely in favor of restorative justice, but I think the notion that retributive justice is pushing out restorative justice is in fact the other way around. Okay, people, that's one of the claims. Oh, you're retributive, you're so retributive, you're pushing restorative justice out. Our latest data is showing, no, restorative justice is pushing retributive justice out, and it's doing it, I think, because powerful leaders like restorative justice, and so do many victims, and so do many intellectuals who like not being retributive. No mentioning names. No, I'm, a valued colleague, Reto Gargarella from Argentina, okay? I went and talked about the trial of the juicios, and he goes, well, I'm against retribution, so I have to be opposed to the trial of the juicios. I'm like going, no, there's two different things. One, there's powerful generals who disappeared 20,000 people, and it's another thing that you think that your justice system, like in the United States, is way too retributive. I believe our US justice system is crazy retributive, But they're two different things, whether we treat ordinary criminals, often poor and vulnerable, and often black in the United States, okay, to too much retribution. And it's another thing whether you prosecute powerful leaders who have violated the rights of their citizens and violated the trust of their citizens. I just think to treat that as all we should be equally opposed to retribution is, before the trials in Greece, okay, there was a zero accountability that any state official could be held accountable. Imagine, that's like a natural experiment, okay? Imagine a country where there's a zero possibility that a criminal can be brought to justice. What does that mean? Zero deterrence. It means chaos, okay? So I don't think we should treat them the same way, that's all.
I'll go with the next.
Yeah.
¿Por qué los juicios de no llevar a una condena pueden tener, sin embargo, un impacto positivo en los derechos humanos? ¿Estos juicios no forman parte de una estrategia de window dressing?
So we don't know for sure. We don't know for sure. The truth is, I don't know. I've never been, had to go through a juicio, but anyone who has gone through a juicio knows that it's actually incredibly difficult, incredibly painful. It's costly. It takes a huge amount of time. It's no gift to have to go through a process of prosecution, even if you're acquitted. Okay, so personally, I think the process of prosecution is costly, even when it doesn't lead to a conviction, and that would be part of the explanation. Are there window dressing trials? Yes. There are many trials that are pure window dressing. There are other trials, legitimate trials. People get acquitted. That's what we want, rule of law. The evidence isn't there. And so I think we need to distinguish between window dressing trials and fair trials where sometimes people get acquitted. And sometimes people are guilty and you just don't have the evidence, and then still you've got to acquit them.
The final question I have here is, retomando la pregunta que hizo al auditorio, ¿eso quiere decir que la lucha por los derechos solo es efectiva cuando se da fuera de los márgenes de las instituciones estatales? ¿Qué posición tiene sobre la paradoja de la institucionalización de los derechos humanos en Latinoamérica y su relación con el populismo?
So, no, I think I'm saying two things. One is that it is true you need civil society organizations to push for change, okay? But if you don't have institutions they can push, You have to have both the institutions, the judicial system, to be able to carry out trials, and then you need, citizen groups to push to make sure those institutions do their job. So you need both civil society groups and institutions, right? And so I don't think anything can happen fuera de las instituciones. But I thought, I was very persuaded by one of the things that by a number of things Sandra said this morning, is that just creating institutions and duplicative institutions can be counterproductive, and we should be attentive to that as well. And, that the idea that maybe, it's better to really, to have single institutions that are capable and accountable, like a fiscalía, just so you have a fiscalía can prosecute, and if it's accountable and capable, then you don't need to have 6 other institutions doing that job. So I think we should be suspicious of creating window dressing institutions, like I'm beginning to think some of these UN investigatory missions are. People feel awful. They can't do anything about Syria. They can't do anything about Sudan. So the new thing at the UN is just make an investigatory commission. And I'm starting to think we should fight back a little about that and say, no, if you can't do anything, then admit you can't do anything, but don't try to pretend you're doing something by creating commissions that will preserve evidence that may never see the light of day.
These are all the questions I have from the audience. I don't know if we can open the floor more for a sort of spoken question, or I can raise another question also.
So I find this discussion super, super interesting, especially, okay, let me back off a little bit. So we all agree that the engine for change, or, the energy to push for improvement in human rights, a lot of it happens domestically, but I really, really appreciate this, attention to transnational action as well, right? Especially over here. But I am drawn, Kathryn, to your challenge to us to help figure out why is it prosecutions have been declining over time. And the reason I bring up the domestic and international is that, but when we think about domestic mobilization, a lot of it, of course, we can benefit if other states and other international institutions could lend a helping hand, but we don't rely so much on international elements. But for transitional justice and for this other international dimension of justice or improvement in human rights, we seem to demand or depend on international or, geopolitical kind of elements a lot more, I feel. And so therefore, that leads me to think about this, why is it that the prosecutions peaked, around 2010? And that leads me to a couple of things. One is that in my own work, I was looking at international institutional order, how it has been decaying. And it's interesting that international global treaties, like international human rights treaties, environmental treaties, all global treaties, the number of them essentially peaked also, just shortly after 2002-ish. And so, and there was an interesting parallel, I feel like. There's the institutional order, in my mind, the fabric of institutional order, the treaties. The number of treaties have declined since 2002. That's one thing I was thinking about. Just the other thing I was thinking about is the U.S. action, like U.S. withdraws its support for the ICC, and that also happened around early 2002-ish. And the non-surrender agreements, a whole bunch of them signed around 2003 and 2004. So I guess what I'm thinking about is this prosecution declining? Is that in some way related to this erosion of international institutional order?
Like 3 big questions, but they're great questions. Okay, let's start with, so yes, I always assign a super interesting article by Polenti et al. In my law class, which is about that international law in general, international treaties, there are fewer international treaties. Now they have an explanation, it's called saturation. And that one explanation is saturation. It's also a more networked society and a new information order, kind of. But saturation makes sense. If you look at human rights law, human rights, we used to be super thin, and now we have very, very rich human rights law. And I think it's a good question to ask. Do we need more treaties, or should we just enforce the treaties we do have? But I should say that I have a fabulous graduate student who's just taken a job at USC, Averill Schmidt, and he looks at that data and he said, actually there's fewer new treaties, but there still are many amendments. So we're working on law, which is another maybe good development. We're doing a more sophisticated move. You don't have to write a new treaty all the time, but we need to fix some problems with treaties we have. It's another thing. So why? Then the next question was, the beginning question was sort of why so many international institutions for justice? Is it geopolitical? We have to remember that in the day before any international justice, any dictator who wanted to escape justice just had to go into exile. Many dictators living on the Riviera and other nice places with a pile of money and no worries about justice. So one reason you need some international tribunals is so people have to like stay home, or else they have to go to countries that they know will protect them. And so even though the ICC is doing a bad job, but state parties to the ICC are doing a bad job executing arrest warrants, and it is not the case that, like in the old days, you could just, move abroad and have a comfortable retirement if you had created mass atrocity, okay? So I think that may be a silver lining we don't even look at. If people move to the Riviera, France may execute that arrest warrant, but they don't. So that's a second piece. I think that's a geopolitical piece that may be good. The United States, as you well know, never supported the ICC. And so the ICC is super interesting because all 5 P5 opposed it at the beginning. It was only when the UK and France changed to governments of the left that they supported it at all. It was never a proposal of the most powerful countries in the world. To this day, China, US, one of the few things China, US, Russia all agree on is they hate the ICC. And so I never expected, the US will never ratify the Rome Statute. I never expected any help whatsoever from the US for the ICC. I expected it to stop trying to kill the ICC, and which even that, it put out, was it arrest warrants, or was it what for Fatou Bensouda? After she decided to open the Palestine investigation and open the Afghanistan investigation. So the U.S. has been an enemy forever, and I think will continue to be an enemy, and probably more during the Trump administration.
Thank you so much. I was very drawn to the effect that reparations have on the length of the peace process, or how long can peace be sustained. And I was just wondering whether that could be because of the different spectrum of the types of reparations that can be ordered in different contexts. We just finished a very broad study on different resolutions of around Latin American reparations, and the distinction is massive. You have some countries where there is just a few monetary compensation, something very, very restricted, and still debating about statutory of limitations applied to reparations. And then you have another process like Colombia, where there is a very, very thoughtful process on how to repair child soldiers, and how non-repetition guarantees would look in certain schemes and specifics, or in relation to certain crimes. And I was just wondering whether that big difference among different types of reparations can be a factor when it comes to the effect that reparations can have.
So I think I already said, I would say the piece of our data that's been least well used by researchers is the reparation data. It's ripe for use, and I encourage you to do it. the best research that members of my team have done is a wonderful survey in Colombia that was done, maybe now 8 years ago or so. And the victims unit actually gave us access, and they were, my colleagues who are the surveyors, were able to survey 3,000 people, 1,000 in the general public, which of course includes many victims, okay? 1,000 who were on the victims registry but had not received reparations yet, and 1,000 on the victims registry who'd received initial reparations, mainly indemnization. And one of the things they found is reparations, people have very many reactions. Like the two most common reaction was being sad and being relieved. But one of the hard, so it's because their loved ones are not being returned to them, but one thing that came out was that people who had received reparations had higher trust in government. And that may be, we think that may be the way through which a reparations policy could have a positive effect on peace, for example, or other good outcomes. If people trust their government more, in part because they've received, much needed reparations, which are also symbolic in the terms of recognition. And so I do think that there's a lot of great research to be done still on reparations.
Kathryn, I think I have a potential explanation for the decline. Just let me be very clear at the outset. I don't think it's right, but I think it might be useful. Could it be that the justice cascade was so effective and it is now having a deterrent effect, and we're seeing a decrease in prosecutions and other justice cascade mechanisms because they've effectively caused people to not behave the way these mechanisms would then require justice to be served? I really don't think that's what's happening, but I wonder if it's happening in some places and in some times, and if you think you could begin to tease out where and when.
So we're trying to work on something called an accountability index. And so you can't just measure the number of trials, reparations, whatever, because some countries, you'd say, whoa, Sweden has no accountability. And you realize, well, Sweden didn't have the legacy of violence, the same legacy of violence that required the same amount of accountability. So we had to start with a measure called legacy of violence. And then we had to have ordinary justice, because maybe a country had a legacy of violence, but they handled it in a good way through their ordinary justice system, and they didn't need special transitional justice. Okay, and then third, we have all of our data, and we're trying to combine it into a single accountability index. Okay, but that is a good way of thinking about it. You just can't count how many truth commissions and say, oh, they're the best. But we are finding that, and this is true for Latin America, and people I think won't believe it, partly because of some of the terrible things we just heard about disappearances in Mexico, right? But compared to the time when transitional justice started in Latin America in the 80s, based on the period of the 70s, compared to the 60s and 70s, reasons for which transitional justice started in the 80s, the legacy of violence was much larger in Latin America at that time than it is today. And now with the end of the Colombian War, pretty much the end, that's another huge legacy of violence that's shutting down. And so I think it is the case, and this doesn't mean I'm talking about Mexico where with 117,000 disappearances, that's a huge legacy, ongoing legacy of violence. But I think there are places of the world where transitional justice has worked. And even some repressive countries, are not killing as many of their opponents as they are. The Bukeles of the world, there are fewer people being killed. I mean, there's mass incarceration, and the killing numbers don't include people killed in jails, and so we don't know exactly what's happening with the murder rate. It's not down as low as he says. But so even someone who's very repressive is using a new model of repression. And that may not be good news for anyone. It's like repressors innovate too, and they're repressing new ways of innovation. They're innovating new ways of repression, excuse me. But I do think that some of this in countries that have applied it more rigorously has had an effect.
Agradezcamos a la profesora Kathryn Sikkink por su presentación, sus intervenciones, sus comentarios, sus reflexiones. Y de nuevo es un honor tenerte por acá.
And thank you for the very interesting format and questions. Okay.
All improvised.